Hello, everyone. I'm not sure if you guys could hear me. Perfect. I see thumbs up. So we'll just give it another minute for folks to come in. We'll give it another minute before we open up some polls to try to get an assessment of people's understanding of the NIH Public Access Policy, how familiar they are with it, and if you're not, it's okay. That's what the presentation's for. Thank you, Dami. So yeah, so the poll has just opened up. So the first question just asks how familiar you are with the NIH Public Access Policy. So there's a list of familiarity levels. So just go ahead and select either one. We'll have this up for 30 seconds or so. So if you're barely entering, we have a poll up, just kind of asking how familiar you are with the NIH Access Policy. If you could please answer it. This will help us a lot. Oh, I see both questions up. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so the second question just asks how many manuscripts have you submitted through the NIH manuscript system? I see that most people have 0. So hopefully, I mean, this presentation is helpful for most people. We'll give it another minute. I think at 1 minute and 45 seconds, Dami, we could go ahead and close the poll. We'll give it like another 10 seconds. But yeah, feel free to kind of introduce yourselves in the group. Just go ahead and share your name and your affiliation in the chat. Thank you, Dami. I'll get the ball rolling. Okay. Chips for so let me drop this in the chat. Yeah, so feel free to just drop in your name so people can kind of get to know each other. I think we're good to go ahead and start. So I just want to say, I want to thank everyone for joining today. I want to thank Elena and Dami for supporting me on today's event. My name is Enrique Sanchez. I am the CHIPS Core Coordinator, as a drop in the chat. I essentially just support the center's efforts in managing publications and making sure publications are in compliance, especially those funded by the NIH. The center is comprised of a wide range of researchers who kind of author several publications year-round. And it's kind of my job to make sure the publications are in compliance with the NIH Public Access Policy. Before I begin my presentation, I kind of want to go over some of the logistics. The meeting is being recorded. The materials, including the recording, as well as the slides, will be posted on the CHIPS website and shared in the follow-up email. We will also have an evaluation to complete. So that's kind of the purpose of the assessment, to kind of evaluate towards the end, kind of how much people kind of learned through the presentation. But if you have any questions, feel free to unmute or enter them in the chat anytime. There will also be times allocated between sections at the end, because it might be a little tricky to kind of monitor the chat for questions. My contact information is also here in the slides in case you kind of want to reach out and ask any additional questions. But that's pretty much it for the logistics. If it's okay, we'll go ahead and start. So I will be presenting on the NIH Public Access Policy and sharing information that will hopefully kind of help you kind of get your publication in compliance. Next slide, Elena, please. Thank you. So what is the NIH Public Access Policy? So this is for people who have NIH funding. So the public access policy kind of ensures that the public has free open access to NIH funded research. So the policy mainly exists for three reasons. One is to kind of create an archive of NIH funded research projects or publications, sorry. The second reason it exists is kind of to advance science. I think the thought process was the more people that can access publications, the greater the possibility to kind of learn, source, and even cite publications in order to kind of advance science or the scientific progress. And the third reason the policy mostly exists is to kind of grant public to taxpayer-funded research. This policy kind of applies to researchers and investigators specifically funded by the NIH. I just wanted to know there are other federal agencies with their own set of policies and requirements. Next slide, Elena, please. So the policy is essentially a requirement that kind of urges scientists to submit their peer-reviewed manuscript, essentially the final version of a paper, usually a Word document that kind of was typed or produced before submitting to a journal. The maximum embargo period is 12 months. And embargo is essentially kind of how much time there is between the submission of a paper for compliance and the kind of the ability to access or view the paper on PubMed Central. But we'll discuss kind of the compliance process as well as what exactly is PubMed Central in a couple slides. I think it's kind of worrying that there are enforcements of the public access policy. So it's not just a request. I just wanted to emphasize that. So before kind of explaining the enforcements, I kind of want to describe how essentially the policy works. So kind of after gathering the necessary materials and submitting them into the NIH system, which I'll refer to NIMS, it is then archived into PubMed Central database, where you'll then receive a PMC ID or PubMed Central identification number. So this PMC ID is going to be requested quite often in the future when you kind of renew your grants. This is especially the case when our center was submitting for renewal. We needed those PMC IDs. If PMC ID is kind of unavailable or not provided, the grant award is not kind of going to continue until you show that a majority of the publications are in compliance or in the process of being compliant with the public access policy. So these enforcements are very worrying, especially when you kind of have the fear of kind of having your grants kind of funding withheld. But I feel like now people with continuous awards have gotten kind of used to the process. However, if you're like a first-time PI or an author on an NIH-funded publication, this process could be a little confusing. Next slide, Elena. Thank you. So before continuing with the submission process, it is very helpful to know how the PubMed Central database kind of is. So PubMed Central is a full text database. It's not the same thing as PubMed, although the names are quite similar. I mean, Central kind of being the only distinction. But what is essentially the difference between PubMed and PubMed Central? So PubMed is an index database, meaning that when you search PubMed, I'm pretty sure some of you are familiar with searching PubMed, what you typically find in your results is a title, an abstract, and kind of an external link to kind of access the paper through the publishing journal. So essentially, you'll just be redirected to another page where you kind of read the publishing journal. In PubMed Central, the full text, including figures, tables, and supplemental materials are all provided in one. By that kind of logic, there are fewer publications in PubMed Central as opposed to PubMed. I think that's the whole idea with having an open access journal. I mean, the more you can access, the less there is. So let's take a look at kind of how this would look like in this image below. So this is something you kind of usually see searching in PubMed. So this is a display of a publication you would potentially search through a PMID, or just the title of the publication. So underneath the abstract highlighted below, you'll see a PMID and a PMC ID. And this doesn't apply to everything found on PubMed, but you'll notice that next to the PMC ID, there's something that says free PMC article bolded in red. So the difference between the PMID and the PMC ID, which are totally different numbers, is that the PMID is an automatically generated when kind of a paper is being published, while a PMC ID, which we'll kind of be focusing more on today, is provided when a paper is in compliance with the NIH Public Access Policy. So if you see the full text link section highlighted in the top right-hand corner, you can see that it says free PMC link. So this means that the publication kind of is funded by the NIH and has been submitted for compliance with the NIH Public Access Policy, having completed the embargo as well as being assigned a PMC ID. Next slide, Elena, please. So if you click the link, you are kind of redirected to a totally different page that grants you access to the full text, not just the abstract. So the page includes more information about the paper, including background, methods, results, conclusions, just everything in one. So the paper featured in PubMed Central, as we have here, was the final author peer-reviewed journal version that was uploaded into NIMS. So there might be minor differences between this version and the published journal version because there might have been a few adjustments made by the journal. So, but the paper should substantially be the same as in PubMed Central, just with a few edits made in the formatting. Additionally, you can also kind of download a PDF file of the publication under the format section if you kind of want to access the journal version of the publication. It is hyperlinked above the title where it kind of says published in the final edited form as, and you go ahead and click the link provided where you can then read the journal version. Sometimes they require you to pay a fee, so that's why I kind of recommend just to read it through PubMed Central, but it's definitely up to you. But I like reading the PubMed Central. I mean, you have everything there in one, and it's open access. Next slide, Elena, please. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So, well, before I continue, does anyone have any questions before I discuss how to submit your paper into PubMed Central? You can also enter them in the chat and I'll go ahead and answer them. No questions, I'll just go ahead and continue. Yeah, please stop me at the end of each section if you want to ask any questions. But now we'll just kind of discussing the methods might be a little confusing. So there are 4 different paths to potentially get your paper in compliance with the NIH Public Access Policy. NCBI has named these paths methods A, B, C, and D. So these methods will kind of help you understand your options for getting a paper in compliance. So just based off how methods A, B, and C, D work, for methods A and B, kind of the publisher will automatically publish the paper on your behalf, while for methods C and D, more manual work and effort is kind of required from the PI or author, or just someone like me that helps support authors in the submission process. But you'll definitely have to submit into the NIMS system, the NIH system. So distinguishing between both sets of methods will kind of help you understand the compliance process. But both methods, C and D, require submission into the NIMS system, where it is then placed into PubMed Central. So you can't really directly upload into PubMed Central. That's why you kind of need the NIH system. Next slide, please. Thank you. So let's begin with method A, which is an open access journal. So it automatically places NIH-funded articles into PubMed Central. So I feel like journals kind of understand that the NIH Public Access Policy affects these papers, especially with withholding grant funding. And they will kind of automatically submit the final version of the manuscript you kind of send to them into the NIMS system. So the good thing about submission A is that there is no author involvement. The publication would just, I mean, the journal would just kind of take care of it, which is good. So this method only applies to certain journals, of course. So there's a list of method A kind of open access journals if you kind of want to double check if your journal qualifies for method A. So let me go ahead and kind of show you how that will look like. So you could just go ahead and visit publicaccess.nih.gov and just select method A journals. It's just Google method A journals -NIH, and it'll give you a whole list of journals that kind of will kind of do the kind of align itself with the open access policy and submit on your behalf. It also gives you a definition in case you kind of are interested in like, oh, what does submission A kind of indicate? But you could go ahead and just search up for a journal here, and it will tell you if the journal will publish on your behalf. Elena, can you put up the slides again? Sorry. Thank you. So yeah, so most of these journals are just open access journals where you kind of had to pay an open access fee to kind of publish through them. But some journals offer this kind of service of publishing on your behalf without an access fee. You just have to kind of double check what your journal is offering to kind of get that reassurance and not have to worry about submitting. Next slide, please. Thank you. So method A, the compliance process is oh, can you go back? Sorry, Elena. Tell you next slide. Yeah, we're talking about method B in here. So yeah, so some journals, like the publication at the time, the journal would kind of take care of it if you pay a fee. But sometimes it will be automatically integrated as a service. For method B, since journals are kind of like a hybrid, you kind of have an option to pay the open access fee. So the publishers listed below do not automatically deposit every NIH-funded public paper or publication into PubMed Central. So rather, the author can choose to kind of arrange with the journal for a deposit of a specific article. But this usually involves kind of choosing the journal's fee-based open access option for publishing that article. So I just recommend kind of contacting the respective journals and directly asking them for what they offer if they publish on your behalf or not. But also for method B, there's also a list of journals that can be found. Similar to method A, there's a list of journals that you can also additionally just search for. But these journals will also submit manuscripts on your behalf, archiving them into PubMed Central and just making them accessible through the journal's own website. So method A and B kind of have to deal with the publishers or the journals you kind of are with. Next slide, please. Before going on to method C and D, does anyone have any questions about methods C and D, A and B? Next slide, Elena, please. Just go ahead and continue. Yeah, if you did not pay an open access fee or APC for methods A and B, otherwise known as the access processing charge, APC, you might need to think about or consider method C. So before you start thinking about depositing or submitting anything into the NIM system, you have to collect a few things, especially for method C. First, you will kind of need an ERA Commons account or an NCBI account. NCBI account is specifically for people supporting authors of PI, just like me. But this is being phased out. There's continuous updates to the login process, which makes it difficult for me. But if you have an NIH grant, you should have this information despite whatever updates they might make. But you will also need kind of a final author version of a manuscript, not the published journal PDF. So when a journal kind of publishes a paper, you kind of sign over the copyright to them. That's why you can't use it to submit into the NIHMS system or the NIM system. Additionally, you will also need to kind of separate documents containing figures, tables, and supplemental material because you'll be submitting them separately into the deposit kind of fields. But kind of that well-formatted publication with the journal's logo, that's definitely copyrighted. So you kind of are unable to submit that into the NIM system as much as you would want to. I mean, it kind of speeds up the process. You could just submit the final product into NIMS. But if you do submit the journal version, PubMed Central will kind of reach out through email and kind of say that they can't accept it, which will kind of delay the process until you upload the final author peer-reviewed kind of version of the manuscript. Lastly, you kind of also need the paper to be peer-reviewed and edited by yourself or someone else before submitting, just making sure that, I mean, the title page is there with proper authorship, proper correspondence, and even referencing is correct. Basically, you have to make sure that, which is funny, that you have to make sure that the final manuscript is similar or exactly the same as the published journal copy. So kind of make sure that you have all these requirements together before you kind of enter NIMS or NIHMS to kind of do your submission. Sometimes this is kind of the hardest part, especially if you kind of did your manuscript collaboratively. It may take a little time to get everything together, having to communicate with other authors to kind of send you the materials and stuff like that. But once you get all the materials, it's pretty simple. You just go to NIHMS. So this image here is kind of the login display for the NIM system, which contains both the ERI Commons and CBI as methods to log in, as well as other agencies, but mostly it's just either the ERI Commons or NCBI. The home display, if it's your first time logging in, we'll kind of provide a tutorial with us, like a very helpful step-by-step wizard. But NIMS also has downloadable kind of tutorials for a closer look at the process. Let me go ahead and share how that would look. Take over, Lena. But yeah, if you just search up NIHMS.nih.gov, you can go ahead and search up tutorials, and this will help you with the login process, which I feel is like the most difficult part because sometimes there's glitches in the system and it just won't accept your account information. But after a few tries, it will go ahead and let you enter. But it also tells you how to deposit files, specifically for people's publications funded by the Gates Foundation and the HHMI, and more information about the initial approval, and the final approval, which both kind of require a revisor or a reviewer being an author or a PI on that specific project. Elena, can you please share again? Thank you. So we'll go to the next slide. So now to kind of show you how to deposit and upload into the NIHMS system. So this is kind of the initial display of the home dashboard that shows you the status of any kind of manuscript submission, whether it's in process, under embargo, or even successfully uploaded into PubMed Central. A list of kind of like submitted manuscripts to be reviewed for submission will be shown here. So as you can see, there's a filter that says NIMS ID or the NIHMS ID. So this number is provided once you kind of submit your paper or the manuscript into the NIMS system. It's basically a temporary ID that you could reference at any point if people request it or request it for renewal. But it means that the paper has begun and it's kind of undergoing the NIH process, the submission process rather. But if you just want to submit a new manuscript, you just go ahead and click on submit new manuscript circled here in red. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when you click the button, you are provided a kind of step-by-step wizard, basically a tutorial that goes over kind of the submission process. So it's going to give you information about what each kind of button does or field does or allows you to do. So what is helpful is that you could kind of populate your paper's information by importing it through PubMed. As you see here, it says PubMed, DOI, or My Bibliography. So, I mean, if you have a paper that's on PubMed and has a PubMed ID, you could just hyperlink to then search for that title through NIMS or even the publication's title or publication's ID. So let me show you how that would look. Additionally, you can also import your entire bibliography, which may not be needed if most of your papers are not funded by the NIH, but it's definitely helpful to import that kind of information. Next slide, Elena, please. Thank you. So once you click import from PubMed option, a pop-up search bar kind of appears that allows you to kind of search the PubMed archive using either using a PubMed ID or the author's name. The results by name will kind of generate a list of publications under that person. So the results will show if either the publication is in compliance or requires to be compliant with NIH Access Policy. But the publications that are in compliance, meaning that they are already found in PubMed Central, are not selectable, so they'll kind of be grayed out. So like we see here in this image, it says in PMC, so it's already in PubMed Central, so you won't be able to go ahead and select that. Next slide, Elena, please. So the next step in the submission process is kind of to associate funding. So trying to find awards and supporting grants associated with the publication. You can also search an award by its number or by its PI author name, similar to how you would kind of search for a publication. So there may be multiple funding mechanisms to kind of add. So if you are unsure of an awardees listed or unsure of the award number associated to the paper, you can look at the acknowledgements or the grant support section of a publication. So let me show you how that will kind of look like. Let me go ahead and share, Elena. So if you're kind of unsure of the awardees listed, so here's a specific publication associated to CHIPS. So I'm expecting to have the CHIPS funding mechanism or CHIPS funding grant award number to be here. But if you just scroll down to very below references to grant support, you will usually find the award number here. So here is, for example, the CHIPS one. But if you're kind of unsure, you could definitely just look at that as well. Thank you, Elena. Can you share the slides at scan? Thank you. So like if you're kind of uploading on behalf of a PI or author, if you have someone uploading on behalf of yourself, kind of you can skip this step and have them kind of add award numbers later when the author or PI reviews a paper. So like when I find myself in this process, I have to make sure that the CHIPS grant is associated as a funding for any publication from our center's PIs. So it's something just to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here are how the results for the search of a funding kind of is displayed. So the results identify the center or organization associated with the award number. The search also kind of identifies the center's director. So this will kind of help you kind of make sure you're trying to associate the correct paper. I mean, if the director is correct and the organization is correct, most likely you found the correct one. But from what I've just found out is that if you kind of associate funding, sometimes the director will also receive an email about the associating paper, so you could just confirm on their behalf. But after finding the right award, just go ahead and select and add. But once again, as a supporting person submitting on behalf of a PI or author, I can just add the center funding, and that's basically it. So I'll just add CHIPS, and that's pretty much it for me. But if you're a PI or author submitting on your own, just make sure that you kind of identify all the grant awards associated to the publication. So as an author or reviewer, you can also add kind of awards after the manuscript has been submitted and converted. You don't have to do it here necessarily, but might as well. I mean, it's already in the steps, so I mean, it will be very helpful. Next slide, please. So the next step in the submission process is to upload the manuscript and any supplemental files that come along with it, which would include tables, figures, videos, and any other supplemental material. So the next step, so this step is a little more kind of work because you have to split up information that is found in the final version of the manuscript. So what the NIHMS or NIMS wants you to kind of do in this step is separate material by figure or tables. So just pretty much separating materials. So let's say throughout a paper, you have 3 figures. You will need to separate them into 3 separate Word documents. Word documents preferably for submitting, because I mean, that's one of the servers or platforms they kind of use to upload. So figure 1, you will essentially do is you divide it into a Word document, put figure 1 with title, figure 2 with title, figure 3 with title, and so on with any other things, any tables or videos. But in some cases, figures, tables, and supplemental materials may not be found in the final version of the manuscript and may already been separated. So just make sure that the manuscript references those materials in the exact location it would be in the publishing, the final published version. So that's definitely something to consider as well. But in some cases, what I have done, and it's worked, is from the actual journal, just place them into a Word document. So just pull materials from the actual published journal version and place them into the Word document if the materials are not found. So for example, if I'm struggling to find a table that was not in the final version of the manuscript, I could just pull that table from the final published journal version and put it into a Word document and submit it that way. But that's pretty much it for how to divide kind of materials and submit it separately. Next slide, please. So the last step is in this process, in the submission process, is to kind of, or depositing process, is to submit or designate a reviewer, essentially, who does kind of the last step. So the reviewer should be someone who is an author or PI on the paper, so they can make sure the manuscript submission is fine when converted by the NIM system and uploaded into PubMed Central. So the response by the NIH-MS kind of representative is very quick in my experience, and it's not automated, so which that's pretty much amazing for me, and should be, I mean, great for you as well. I mean, you would kind of want a quicker response and not an automated response. But once you're kind of assigned a representative that kind of reviews your submission, they will respond to you if you have any questions or if there's any problems with the submission process. But in terms of designating a reviewer, you can similarly just search up an author PI through PubMed to add as a reviewer. They will then be saved as a search, so you don't have to search for them again. And this is very helpful for when you're kind of submitting multiple papers for compliance under that single author, so you have to keep looking for them. So right here underneath, you'll see release delay, which is basically an embargo period. As I mentioned earlier, PubMed Central kind of allows you to have up to 12 months of an embargo. So what this means is that you could kind of upload it now, and people won't be able to read it until the end of the embargo, until the end of the 12 months, essentially. Some journals kind of ask you to kind of do this with a maximum embargo of 12 months. So they kind of want to have exclusive rights to the paper for a limited time, kind of before publishing it into PubMed Central. But if you kind of are unsure of the embargo period, you could always ask your journal, and they will tell you how many months of an embargo you should have. But I mean, ideally, well, not ideally, but the thought is that if your paper has been published for a while now, more than 2 years, let's say, and you discovered it has not been in compliance with the NIH Public Access Policy this whole time, you will kind of need to select to make this kind of immediately available. So this process can definitely speed up. So the length of the embargo kind of depends on how long a paper has been out of compliance. Next slide, please. Does anyone have any questions before I continue? Okay. I think I see a question in the chat. So the question reads, I have a question that might be jumping ahead for this workshop. I'm helping update a researcher's bibliography for their progress report. Most of us are compliant for the process. By solid grants have been attached. So as citations, mandatory, always linked. I would say it's definitely recommended. I mean, I would say it's mandatory, but I will also recommend to kind of update it with all the grant awards. I mean, you kind of want to recognize the funding sources for a publication. This could also be difficult when kind of the NIH-MS reaches out and be like, oh, not all funding was identified. So they could definitely reach out and, I mean, kind of force you to kind of do that process all over again, which is a hassle. So, I mean, if you could add the grants, might as well add the grants there and then, so you won't have to kind of anticipate the NIH-MS representatives to reach out and kind of say that you need to add the grant funding, or the proper grant funding is not recognized or acknowledged. Hopefully that helped. Okay. Let's see things. Okay, perfect. Okay. So where was I at? Yeah, so next slide, please. Okay, so after this, what happens is that there's going to be a period of time, technically up to 6 weeks, where the NIMS is going to the NIMS system is going to ask you to, or not ask you, is going to convert your manuscript. So while your paper is being processed, you are provided interim ID, known as the NIH-MS ID or the NIMS ID. So this ID will kind of help you report your submission into the NIH-MS system or the NIMS system. In the meantime, if it's requested before having a PMC ID. This is specifically true when like our center was submitting renewals. I mean, if a certain publication did not have a PMC ID, the next best thing was having NIH-MS ID, which indicates that it's been submitted for within the process. But having the number means that the NIH knows that you have at least started the submission process for the manuscript. So although the NIH may know that it's been submitted, PubMed may not. So just keep that in mind, but there's a process for that as well. So after they're kind of done with the conversion, the reviewer will get an email kind of notifying them of an approval that is needed. So the reviewer will get an email. So their job is essentially to click that email, or if they lose the email, they could log into NIMS as well and access the email there and access the review process there, the step they're kind of currently on. But the email would say that your paper has been submitted to the NIHMS. They essentially have to review if the manuscript's all right and if the tables figures are displayed correctly or even labeled correctly. So that final approval needs to be done to kind of receive a PMC ID. So people can't forget to kind of look at their emails or think it's done because, I mean, you submit something and you kind of think, oh, it's over with, which happens sometimes and the paper kind of gets stuck here. But you have to do that last review step as an author or a PI to kind of continue with the compliance process. Next slide, please. Hope you're on time. Time's good. Okay. So this is a nice graphic that the NIH kind of has to capture the process from submitting to it being available in the PubMed Central. But initially, you just deposit files into NIHMS system. Anyone could deposit files, actually, even I can. So someone who supports authors in depositing their manuscript will kind of also get an email. So like someone like me would also get an email as well as the author. If the author deposits themselves, they would just get the email and just go ahead and take care of the rest. But the reviewer should definitely be an author that will receive the link for approval. So somebody has to make sure that the funding was assigned and materials were uploaded correctly. So I just want to note that there are some funding kind of requires obligations outside of NIMS and PubMed Central. So you kind of need to figure that out. If a particular funding has their own process for having an open access journal. But afterwards, I mean, the NIMS kind of handles the conversion process before sending it back to you, the reviewer, for a final approval. So there's two steps for approval. There's an initial approval and a final approval. But shortly after, depending on the embargo period, you will be assigned a PMC ID, which is the 5th step. And lastly, you'll kind of have the publication become accessible through PubMed Central, which is the last step. And you won't really have to worry about anything then, only kind of reporting the PMC ID if it's asked for. But you'll be asked for in case there's a renewal or a progress report being submitted. Next slide, please. So kind of what could go wrong? So during the submission process, what kind of usually happens, which is fine, is that there might be errors that require you to resubmit your files. So people will often kind of submit the PDF journal version, which is a big no-no. So they will upload a manuscript that is not the final version, has possibly incorrect referencing to tables and figures. So in that case, they will kind of, NIMS will ask you to kind of re-upload the correct file or make changes. So if there's a delay in the submission process, it's because of this step. So here's an example of one of the emails that I received that I need to make some changes before resubmitting. In this case, a reference was missing in the final manuscript version. So there was a total of 37 references listed at the end of the publication, towards the end of the publication. However, only 36 were referenced throughout the text. So yeah, they're very observant of any mistake. So just keep in mind that anything can make the process take a step back and have to resubmit. But I think also with this journal, there was also I was missing a complete title page with proper authorship and their affiliations. So they keep an eye on all that stuff. But it's mostly just mostly the errors are just wrongful labeling of tables and stuff like that. But a deposit doesn't usually take long, especially if you kind of have all the files you need. So if you miss something, try not to. So because NIHMS will kind of catch it. But once again, if it's very helpful, kind of use the final journal copy to kind of make sure everything is in order and referenced correctly. That's what I kind of do on my end. Next slide, please. I know method C was a lot of cover before I continue with method D, does anyone have any questions? Let's see if there's any in the chat. You go to the next slide, Elena. Thank you. So, so method D, in this specific case, kind of publishers can facilitate the deposit process. So this is something you would have to opt into. For example, here's an image below that kind of indicates the process of opting into and how it will kind of look like. For example, this one specifically says, if this manuscript is accepted for publication, please archive it on behalf of the authors. So by choosing this option, I authorize so-and-so to kind of transmit information to archive, to the archive I specify. In our case, or in this case, we will specify PubMed Central, or depending on your grant funding, it may be another open access requirement system, but you just go ahead and select it. You kind of need to let publishers know that your manuscript needs to be submitted into PubMed Central, and they will go ahead and kind of upload it on your behalf. But as an author, you still need to do step 2, which was the initial review. But anyone could submit the manuscript. In this specific case, the journal would do it on your behalf, or the publisher. So I recommend you kind of look into this if you are publishing an NIH-funded journal or a funded research paper, sorry. So make sure you read any options that they give you or any check boxes that will kind of help you make the process easier or help you with the process. Before jumping into the next section about looking at your compliance, I kind of wanted to recap the methods real quick. So methods A and B are open access journal options, sometimes paying an APC or an access processing charge. Not all the times, I mean, but method C is where you kind of do it yourself. Method D, you kind of opting in for the publishers to do step 1 for you, which is the deposit files. But in any and all cases, any methods, the author PI will have to do step 2 and 3, which is 2 and 4 actually, which is initial and final approval or review. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do you know what you need to do? So how do you keep track of what publications are in compliance or out of compliance? So if you visit My Bibliography through PubMed's login and redirect towards the dashboard, you will be taken to a display that kind of looks like this. This only applies to researchers and scientists. I myself do not have access to an NCBI account or this My Bibliography PubMed login, because I'm not a researcher yet. But this is how your bibliography would typically look. So this provides a summary of the publications you are author on, usually listed by order of what's been published most recently. So next to the publications are compliance status reports. As you can see here, it's either green, which highlights that the publication's in compliance, or it's either red, which means that the publication is not in compliance. So to address the non-compliance status, you select edit status. That's hyperlinked next to where it says not defined. So as part of the updating the compliance process, you will have to verify if the NIH partially or entirely support the citation. In most instances, they, support funding for the entire citation. But if yes, you will be informed of the NIH Public Access Policy, which we kind of went through, and will be provided a few options to kind of update compliance status or get the publication in compliance. Since methods, sorry. Sorry, recently I got a dog and just barking it up. So yeah, so to address the non-compliance status, you just go ahead and select the edit status link. But yeah, since PubMed has no kind of record of the publication in the NIM system, you have many options. Either you can begin the NIH-MS compliance process, which we have covered in previous slides. But if you have already started the process, the submission process of NIMS, you can enter the temporary NIH-MS ID. So this is one kind of important thing of having that temporary ID. So it could clear the status on this end. So you just go ahead and enter the NIMS ID. But however, if you kind of imported through PubMed the information, that was required on NIMS to kind of import that information. You don't have to enter the temporary ID number. You can also inform the PubMed system that arrangements have kind of been made with your publisher through an open access feed to kind of update the compliance status, otherwise known as Method B. Lastly, you can also inform the system that the publication does not require to be submitted under the public access policy. So these are specific exemptions. I mean, some exemptions are that the publication was not peer-reviewed. Sometimes paper will end up being editorials, so you can kind of mark those as exempt. Sometimes publication, another exemption, sorry, is if a publication was accepted before April 2008. Another exemption of this requiring it to be NIH Public Access compliant is to have that publication be written in another language or a script, whether Russian, Japanese, Spanish. So you won't have to do that there. Or the last one, which is mostly the most kind of clear one, is that the publication was not funded by the NIH. Next slide, please. I think this is a final slide. So here's a closer look at kind of the two compliance statuses. If you kind of want to add grants after the fact, you could add them here by clicking awards underneath the compliance status. Also want to mention that you can also link your PubMed with the ERA Commons, or even share your bibliography, as I mentioned before, with others, especially supporting you with the publication compliance. So, I mean, if you have someone supporting kind of you with the publication compliance process, it'll be good to kind of submit or share with them your bibliography so they could kind of see what else is kind of out of compliance and help you with all your non-compliant publications. Last slide, please. This should be the final slide. So that was most of what I kind of wanted to share with you. So NCBI goes through various kind of updates, annoyingly kind of requires you to kind of change passwords every so often. The latest update is kind of confusing, which has to do with an additional step of having you log in to your NCBI with your Google or Facebook, which is a hassle sometimes. But hopefully the depositing process wasn't too confusing. But here's my contact information. You want to kind of reach out and ask any kind of additional questions about the NIHMS system, or you want me to share some information or links, I could definitely do so as well. But yeah, I could definitely take any questions. I know we kind of ended a couple minutes short on time, so I can just take some time to answer any questions. Feel free to unmute or just type it into the chat. If you want any clarity on anything, just go ahead and ask. But I also want to thank Dami and Elena for supporting me on today's event. And if you want to kind of subscribe to the CHIPS listserv as well to kind of keep updated with future lectures or anything that's current within the CHIPS Center, you will share the link as well. But as I mentioned before, a copy of the recording and slides will be published onto the CHIPS website, and there will be a follow-up email with more of that information. I think the message came in. So I'll give a few minutes for any questions if anyone has any. Thank you. Thank you for joining, Delara. Yeah, we're planning to do this twice a year, specifically NIH Public Access Policy, covering it again. This is the first one that occurred this year. We're hoping to do it a few months back, but I mean, it's better late than never. And we'll have another one towards the end of the year. And here's a copy, a link to our listserv if you kind of want to stay updated with our information. I think I saw a question. So thank you, Wen, for the question, or more of a clarification. So Wen said, if anyone that has an ERA Common account, then you should be able to view the compliance status view in my bibliography. Okay.
Enrique, I have a quick question. So first of all, thank you so much for this presentation. I think it was really informative and helpful. So for those of us who are new to this process, you mentioned a couple of things that could go wrong. I'm just kind of wondering, what are the most common things that you see kind of going wrong in the process that we should kind of anticipate and make sure to kind of have foresight on if we're really new to the process?
So like, since this is the final kind of peer-reviewed manuscript version, they'll send you you'll probably receive a document that has edits that haven't been confirmed yet. So as like someone who, like me, who's supporting a publication or a PR author with their publication to being submitted for compliance, you can't really guess if all the edits were made or if some things were cut out. So it's definitely helpful to look at kind of that final journal kind of published manuscript, so you can kind of identify or compare both. Another challenge that usually occurs, well, I wouldn't say a challenge, but another anticipated problem that you kind of have to look for is kind of improper referencing. So throughout the text, sometimes throughout the final manuscript, you won't have sometimes the table or video there. It might be already separated, but usually it will have the text and I'll be like, oh, figure 1 is supposed to be here, right? Something in that kind of shape, way, or form. So it'll be figure 1 here, but then there won't be a figure, right? Then the figure's not included, or it's just in the wrong place. Or similar to me, where I had one of the publications had 37 references, but only 36 were referenced in the text. So you have to kind of look back at the references, like, okay, is every reference referenced in the text? So those are kind of some things to anticipate.
Great, thank you.
Could I also add something too?
Go ahead.
Hi, this is Wendy. Great job, Enrique. Thank you so much for all the information that you shared. It was really helpful. And so I think one of the things in terms of kind of adding to what you said in terms of like tips, in terms of like things that could possibly delay the process, is when you're selecting, trying to figure out like who to select for the reviewer, is really important that the reviewer that's selected, which is to be like one of the co-authors that are on that publication, is for that person to be available to actually be available to check their emails and to approve the uploads and to kind of make sure that it goes through completion. Because oftentimes when you select, potentially a co-author on that paper, if they're not available, sometimes it will just sit in the queue, and that sometimes can stall the process quite a bit. So it's really important to like let the reviewer that's being selected, that they should be checking their emails regularly to make sure that they're approving when they're asked to. Yes,
I definitely, that's something good to know as well. Yeah, but that's definitely for the review process. Similar goes to the depositing process. I mean, if it's hard to get a hold of someone, you kind of want to kind of go ahead and communicate with them and get those materials for the submission process. And even then, communicate with them for they could kind of do that initial review and that final review as well. Is there any more questions? But yeah, we'll go ahead and send an email with an evaluation as well as resources for today's event. I just want to thank everyone for joining. I want to thank Elena and Dami and even Wen for some clarity. I appreciate it. But yeah, there'll be a second presentation on exactly the NIH Access Policy probably towards the end of the year. Thank you everyone for joining.